Well, hello everyone. Thanks for joining us for this introduction to IRender nXt. My name is Russell Holden and I'm with RenderPlus Systems. I have just a few announcements before we get this started. First of all, this is intended as a no experience required event. So if you have a trial version of IRender nXt installed and you're looking for some help getting started, or maybe you're just exploring rendering software and you're wondering if IRender nXt is the right software for you. In both of those cases, you've come to the right place. We are recording this webinar, and once the webinar finishes, I'll upload the video to the RenderPlus Systems channel on YouTube. You'll receive a notice from us with the address so that you'll be able to visit our RenderPlus channel and review the webinar as many times as you like. I also want to mention that if you haven't visited the RenderPlus Systems channel on YouTube, please do so. There are quite a few IRender nXt experts who have some very nice tips and tricks on creating photorealistic renderings with IRender nXt. You'll find them very helpful. Also, we don't know specifically how you use SketchUp in your office. So today, here's what we're going to do. First, I'm going to open the model, a model of an object, in this case a wooden table, and we'll create some renderings from it. The table that I'm going to load is from the 3D warehouse. Next, we'll load a model of a beach cottage, also from the 3D warehouse. And then finally, we've built an office, a small office interior, and we'll have a lot of fun with that with IRender nXt. In each of these examples, we're going to focus on how IRender nXt facilitates the creation of photorealistic renderings from SketchUp models. Please ask questions during the webinar, and I'll do my best to pause, answer your question, and then we'll move on. And in fact, we have a question. Is the YouTube video ready from yesterday's webinar? Yes, it most certainly is. And in fact, you should be receiving an email probably the first part of the week that is going to give you a link. If you're impatient about that, I was this morning, so I went out to the RenderPlus Systems channel on YouTube and watched the video. I also need you to let me know if I'm either going too fast or speaking too fast, and I say mostly for the benefit of those of you who may not be native English speakers. I know that we have a tendency to speak English really fast. If I'm going too fast, please put the word fast as a question. That'll prompt me to slow down. So thanks again for joining us, everyone. I hope that this is a very meaningful event for you, that you'll learn some interesting things about IRender nXt, and that by the time we're done, you'll be ready to start SketchUp, open up a model, and confidently approach photorealistic rendering. Now, as I promised, this is from the 3D warehouse. It's a wooden table, and when I open it in SketchUp, I don't need to do anything to it at all other than render. Now, if you have installed a trial version of IRender nXt, when you launch SketchUp and open a model, you won't have any access to IRender nXt menus until you click Extensions. And when you do, this drop-down menu will offer the IRender nXt software. So click IRender nXt 6 Load, and the interface will load for you. Once we have a model open, I'm always pretty anxious to just create a rendering. So we'll click Render, and we see this dialog. This is the IRender nXt rendering settings dialog, and across the top you'll notice that there are 5 lighting presets. These are very useful for novice and expert IRender nXt users. They prevent the creation of a rendering with no lighting whatsoever, and so your screen would end up being blank. We're going to use quite a few of these today. The first one, very appropriate for our table, is a lighting preset called Studio High Dynamic. And this is the way it works. Imagine that you had a table and you took it to a professional photographer because you wanted a nice photograph for your catalog. This is what the photographer would do. Set up a bunch of lights, a bunch of reflectors, some frosted glass perhaps, and in the end create for you a very nice photograph for your catalog. So Studio High Dynamic emulates this kind of lighting setting. Once Studio High Dynamic is selected, all we need to do is start the rendering. And here's a rendering of our table. Now today, I'm going to be mentioning this several times. There are a couple of key factors to photorealistic rendering. The first and probably most obvious is that we have access to materials that are photorealistic. This is a photograph of wood, and so it is in and of itself very real. But what the model lacks in looking photoreal is the finish on the wood. What I want to do is click on the wood. That brings up this pop-up menu, and one option is Edit Material. Now, I do want you to notice one thing very interesting. We have not returned to SketchUp in order to do this. I'm still looking at the IRender nXt render window. So once a rendering is complete, I can click on a surface and edit a material. That brings up this pop-up menu. And what I want to do is I want to change the finish of this wood to reflective. Click Reflective, click OK, and now render the model. This is the effect of Studio High Dynamic lighting with a reflective wood surface. You'll notice very subtle shading on this model underneath this table, all down in here. The biggest benefit of all of Studio High Dynamic lighting is this wood is now sampled in very bright light, in filtered light, and also in shadow. The nice thing about that is now when I use this model of a table in another model, I can reliably predict how the wood will render in virtually any lighting condition. So it's a nice preview of how the table will render. Now I embellished this a little bit. This might be more what a photographer would provide for me. This was rendered with Studio High Dynamic, with the Studio High Dynamic lighting preset. And of course I added, for the purposes of helping with scale, a newspaper and a vase. Now recently I was asked questions about the ability of IRender nXt to create renderings that are not photorealistic. Of course, we emphasize photoreal, but there are frequently times when renderings that are a little bit more artistic, not quite so real, are also appropriate. Here's an obvious one, the same rendering, but with all the color removed. This one is even more interesting, just a shaded colored model. Definitely not photoreal. And then this rendering option, this is called a clay rendering. And so this is created completely from white clay, and it's of course illuminated properly because we're using Studio High Dynamic lighting. So while photorealistic renderings are important, there are lots of options in IRender nXt. I've only showed you a small sample that also allow you to create renderings that are very artistic, but not exclusively photorealistic. Now, I'd like to pause for a minute, and if anyone has questions about Studio High Dynamic lighting and how it works, if you have ideas about other areas where Studio High Dynamic lighting might be interesting, or just questions about this model, good time to ask them. And Bill has a question. He's wondering how this lighting actually is created, because it's obviously not a bunch of independent lights around a model. And Bill, that is a good question. Excuse me, let me back up. Studio high dynamic lighting is actually the appearance of the sunlight as filtered down to the model through a canopy of trees. The most interesting thing about this lighting preset is that there are, even though there is really only one light source, in this case it is the sun, there are multiple surfaces in the model that are actually throwing light on the model. And that's why we get all these really interesting shadows underneath the model. So the idea is that it mimics a studio lighting scenario, but it isn't literally studio lighting. I'm going to move on. If anyone else has a question about studio high dynamic lighting or this model in particular, we can always come back to it. Now, this is an important thing for everyone to understand about IRender nXt and how we render a model. I actually made this just this morning to illustrate this point. In this model, there is only one light source. It's right here. And it's a point light that is pointing at this wall. What this illustrates is that all surfaces in a model are reflective. Most of these surfaces are just reflecting light. So this brick wall in the back is illuminated by light bouncing off of this wall, off of the floor, off of this wall, off of the ceiling, off of the wall that is over my shoulder, and to some degree off of the column. In turn, the brick wall is also reflecting light, and you'll notice that even the back of this column, although there is no direct light shining on the back of this column at all, there's enough light reflected off of the brick wall and off of the wall back here and the wall over my shoulder that the back of the column is illuminated as well. So all surfaces are reflecting light, and light is bouncing around the model, illuminating all of the other surfaces. In this case, all accomplished from one light. This is going to be important as we move on to the next model. This is a beach cabin. Again, this is from the 3D warehouse. And the nice thing about these 3D warehouse models is that when you open them, you don't need to do anything except click the render button. When we do for this model, we're going to change to a different lighting preset. This one's probably quite a lot easier to understand. This is exterior lighting, and it says with sun. What that means is that the sun is going to be used to cast shadows. Click Start Rendering, and here's the rendering. So here's the sun shadow. You'll notice that the sky is the default SketchUp sky, and all of the glass in our model is reflective. The glass here is reflecting the sky. Down here it's reflecting the sky and also reflecting the columns. Pretty nice. I'd like to make this a little bit more convincing because I actually want a more convincing reflection in the windows. And what I want to show you is that it's not necessary to return to SketchUp, make adjustments to the model, and then create a whole new rendering. Now this didn't take that long. Across the bottom you can see that this rendering was completed in 20 passes, not very many, and it took 2 minutes to render. So it wouldn't be that big of a deal, but it's even faster when you use this tool. This is the tone operator and filters dialog. And what I'd like to do is just increase the overall brightness of my rendering. That's done right here. So I'm going to bump this up from 50 to 60, and already you can see that the reflection of the sky is much more convincing, and additionally, because now there's more light entering into the building, I can actually see through the glass quite a bit better. What I'm not very happy about is that brightening the image caused me to lose a little bit of detail on this siding. So we're going to use a filter to adjust that. It's called the sharpen filter, and all I do is click, and now I have all of that detail restored to the siding. So now the image is a little bit brighter, still nice detail, great reflections in the windows. This is another way to get to render settings. And you'll notice that along the left-hand side, there's a nice long list of render settings. None of these are very complicated. They're actually pretty easy to understand. The first one, presets, brings us back to a dialog that we're getting pretty familiar with. And another of the lighting presets is high dynamic range image to be used as a sky and also the background of our rendering. When we select it, all we need to do following is click Render. Now instead of the SketchUp default sky, we have this really nice photographic sky with clouds. And look what that does to the reflections. Now instead of just boring blue, I have cloud reflections in my windows. The illumination to the model from the sky is actually quite a bit brighter, and that means it's even lighter inside the building, so the windows also become a little bit more transparent. In fact, it's very evident here where I can actually see through the building to a door in the back. Now I want you to keep in mind that so far this has been accomplished without requiring me to return to SketchUp. So what I'm doing is I'm taking a completed rendering and I'm enhancing it for the presentation that I have coming up. There are more options, interestingly enough, and one of them is effects. An effect that is actually quite nice, especially on this model, is the use of haze. This is a very straightforward setting. First is the near setting, which simply describes how far from where I'm standing is the haze going to begin. And in all fairness, I've actually experimented with this a little bit, so I know that the right distance for this model from where I'm standing is 70 feet. Once I have the distance set, I just need to increase the strength of the haze, and look what happens. Now this haze separates my wonderful project from this adjacent building. It's going to help my client keep focused on my building so that I can point out all of the great design features. So far, from one completed rendering, I actually have 3 renderings that I can save and decide whether or not I want to use them in my presentation. The first is a rendering with the SketchUp sky. That was actually a pretty nice rendering, especially when we brightened it and kind of improved on the detail and improved the reflections in the windows. Personally, the one I like a little bit better is with the sky background and the clouds in the windows. So that's rendering number 2. And now a third rendering, which uses haze to push this adjacent building back away from mine, emphasizing my project in the rendering. So from one completed rendering, which took 2 minutes 6 seconds, I end up with 3 renderings, any one or all of which might be appropriate for a presentation to my clients. Now, so far, we've looked at Studio High Dynamic Lighting as a preset. We've looked at the preset using the sunlight to cast shadows. And then we looked at using a high dynamic range image as a sky background, and that high dynamic range image is also used to cast light and shadows on our model. So 3 lighting presets, 3 very different style of renderings, and I hope you'll all agree that these lighting presets are quite valuable because so many lighting parameters that I would otherwise have to set up on my own are taken care of for me. I had one other thing that I wanted to do with this model. The daytime images are really, really nice, but what I'd like to do is take the same model and I'd like to show you how little it actually takes to turn a daytime model into a nighttime model. And again, I'm going to accomplish this without having to return to SketchUp. So we're going to do this on a completed rendering. And this is going to introduce you to a very nice and very powerful IRender nXt feature called lighting channels. So here's the lighting channels dialog. Now this is displaying 5 of the 8 lighting channels, and each of them are labeled. So the first one is the sun. You'll notice that although this was actually rendered with an HDRI sky, by default the sun is turned off when you choose the HDRI sky lighting preset. But you're able to go back to the settings menu and turn the sun back on, which I did, and that gives me a nice sun shadow along with all of the shadows and highlights that are created by the HDRI sky. So you don't have to settle for the lighting preset. You have 100% control over managing the lighting for your renderings. Now keep in mind, my intention is to tone this model down and create a nighttime image. So the first thing that I want to do is I want to just turn the sun channel off. That means uncheck it. So when it's unchecked, it's off, and you can tell that it's off because now the sun shadow here and on this wall is gone. Next, lighting channels allows me to turn lights on and off, and also allows me to change the relative brightness of each channel. One of the channels is the sky. Currently, the brightness of the sky is set to 0.8. Full on would be 1. I'm going to turn sky down to 0.2. So I've darkened it considerably. And now, of course, my building, unfortunately, has gotten a bit dark. So why don't we turn on the garden lights, the porch light, and then I'm just calling them recessed lights because they are recessed can lights underneath this small porch. And I admit I had a little bit of fun with the garden lights because I made them color. So I've got a red one, a yellow one, and a blue one. Now this is a much more dramatic change to a completed rendering, isn't it? Because I've taken a bright daylight image with beautiful cloud reflections. I've dimmed everything down, turned on some lights, and now I have an evening image of my model. All done on a completed rendering using a very advanced IRender nXt feature called lighting channels. And we'll be playing with that, with lighting channels, more in the next model. So here's yet another presentation rendering that I'm able to accomplish from an investment of 2 minutes and 6 seconds to render the model. Here's the third model I promised. This is actually not from the 3D warehouse. This is a model that we created specifically for the purposes of demonstrating some more advanced features in IRender nXt. It is a pretty simple little model, But I'd like you to take note of a couple of very interesting features. The first is this glass table and the beautiful reflections in the table. The second is that this vase, if you remember, this vase was from, I used it on the table, but it was a white vase. When I brought it into this model, I changed the color to gold and I made it very reflective. I did the same with this lamp. When I brought this lamp in from 3D Warehouse, it was actually black. I changed it to gold and I made it reflective, and now it looks like a nice brass lamp. So when you bring models in from 3D Warehouse, you can use them as is. They're wonderful. And they are absolutely ready for you to put into your model, click render, and away you go. But you also can modify them if you want to and make them more tailored to the design ideas that you have for your model. It's very important in IRender nXt to understand lighting. And in this webinar, we're going to touch on lighting very lightly. We're going to add a few lights to the model and set some attributes. I want to just mention that coming up next week, we have another webinar scheduled. You can check RenderPlus.com. We have our webinar schedule listed there to show you the date and the times. I'm going to guess that it's next Thursday, and I think I'm right. And during that webinar, our purpose is this. We want to help you go from novice to expert with IRender nXt lighting. So today, this is going to be just a brief introduction. The arrow is pointing to the Render Ready Components dialog, which looks like this. And the first thing I'd like to do on the Ceilings tab is just position a couple of round recessed lights in the ceiling. I want to point out that all of the attributes of the light that need to be set in order to place a light in your model are right here on this dialog. When you're satisfied, click Create Place and place lights. Now I'm placed multiple, so I actually positioned a light here and I positioned a light here. Right back to the dialog, here's the lamp, and as I told you, when I first grabbed it, it was black, and then I modified it so that it would be more interesting for my model. Same thing, place it and pop it into your model. Now I have a surprise for you, because you see the picture of the sailboat on the wall. Actually, that's a television. And what I want to point out is that with IRender nXt, anything can be a light. And here's how you do it. So we double click on the television set to explode it. And now we specifically go after the image on the television screen. And with this pop-up, what I want to do is set the object properties for that television screen. And specifically, that means treat the television screen as a light and give it 200 watts of brightness. Those two settings, that's it. The television screen is now a light. Let's render. Now this time we're going to change to another lighting preset called Interior Lighting with the Sun. I have a window in the back, so it'd be nice to let the sunshine in. Here's our rendering. Now again, what we have in front of us is the rendering window. So this is not the SketchUp window. This is the IRender nXt overlay window. And what I want to do is click on this column. It's actually quite nice as it is, just sort of a painted red column. But one of the great features of IRender nXt that you'll want to learn to take control of is managing reflective materials. When I click on it, this dialog comes up. This is the Edit Material dialog. And this you've seen before, because now we're back to the finishes portion of the dialog. Now, I appreciate that all of these seem to be very focused on whether or not a material, how it reflects or is transparent. But if you think of this in terms of finishes, what I want my column, the finish that I want in my column is a shiny metal finish or polished metal finish. Because when I apply that finish and then render the model, here's what I accomplish. Now it looks as though it's wrapped in shiny red metal. And I did this without further adjustments to the reflective property. I was satisfied with selecting metal and clicking OK, knowing that the default settings for metal are going to be very appropriate for the look I'm after. But of course, I can also go back to the materials dialog and edit these settings very, very specifically. Now, you're going to think I have a fascination with going from daytime images to nighttime images, but actually that's such a dramatic change to an image that I know it'll make the impression that I want to make, which mostly is centered on this. Once a rendering is completed, you have the possibility of taking one rendering. In this case, this rendering took a couple of hours because I think I went 500 passes, and modify the rendering to create another possible presentation image for your interview or a presentation to your client. So again, the first approach for me is going to be to lower the overall brightness of this image, to go from bright daylight to an evening image. Look at the bottom arrow, saturation. This for nighttime images is also pretty important, because as you know, if you walk into your living room in the middle of the night with very little lighting, the colors are not quite so bright because, of course, there's less light reflecting back from surfaces to your eyes. So what I do is lower the brightness down 10 points to 40 and saturation down 30 points from 100 to 70 to dim all of the colors. And that gives me a much more convincing evening image. I still have a couple of things I need to work on. For example, so I'm going to go back to my handy lighting channels dialog. The first thing that I want to do is turn off the sky. This is one of the things that really impresses me about these renderers, and that is once there's less light coming into the room, notice how the inside of the room starts reflecting in the glass. So there's still plenty of light on this tree, I can see it, but there's so little light now outside compared to inside that I can see the lights, and I can actually even see the pictures reflecting on the glass. And that'll improve even more in just a minute. Now the television for a dark room is a little bit dark, so what I'm going to do is brighten it. That's the benefit of being able to make anything in your model behave as a light. Let's turn off the ceiling lights to dim the room a little bit more. Ceiling lights on, ceiling lights off. Watch the walls and how they change so nicely. And then lastly, I didn't want to turn the sun completely off, but I really lowered the value of the sun from a 1 down to a 0.1. So now I have the effect of maybe the moon shining in through the window. On your screens, this might be a little dark. On my screen, it looks absolutely fantastic. And I would not hesitate for a minute to show this to a client because it's very, very nice lighting in this room. And again, here is the original rendering, all completed with IRender nXt. Now, Everyone has been incredibly quiet throughout this entire webinar, which means I got through it a whole lot faster than I usually do. So, are there any questions about any of the information that we've covered this afternoon? And please don't be shy. We can back up to anything. I'm not going to repeat what this person's saying, but actually I might, because this is very nice of all of you. I'm getting some really nice compliments and I really appreciate it. Let me ask you this. From the time that you entered this webinar to now, how many of you feel that you've learned something meaningful and that you will go back to SketchUp, open up a model real quick, and you're going to have a lot more confidence in creating a really nice rendering with your model? Okay, once again, now the question board is absolutely being flooded, and I'm really grateful for everything that everyone is saying. I want to mention 2 upcoming webinars that I think you'll really appreciate, and that will even help you gain more expertise with IRender nXt and some of the advanced features. I appreciate that when you install a photorealistic renderer, it can seem as though the software is going to be really, really complicated. And I can tell you at RenderPlus, that's not our approach at all. We have all of the features of the other renderers and then some. But what we strive to do is make these features accessible and easy to understand. I hope we're accomplishing that. We certainly try to. At the same time, there's still a fair bit to be learned about how these renderers actually work. And so next week, I hope you'll register for our lighting webinar, which is going to cover lighting in exhausting detail. It'll absolutely take an hour to go through lighting to show you all of the wonderful things that lighting can do. The following week, we're going to dedicate a 1-hour-long webinar to reflections, because reflections is another topic that, and I typically refer to it as finishes. Okay, wow, somebody finally asked a question. Is the material library and finishes more important than good lighting effects? That is such a great question. I would have to say that the proper selection of a material and then adjusting the material finish so that it is accurate when matched against the real world material is absolutely as important as good lighting. And I'll tell you the one thing wrong with this model. The one thing wrong with this model is when I made it, you'll notice all of the lights are white, which makes this rendering less photoreal than it could be. Because in actual fact, if this is an incandescent bulb in this light fixture, we all know as designers that bulb is not white. And so we're going to talk about this in great detail next week, that most lights are not white. And thank you, someone just said, good point. Thank you very much, because I bang that drum a lot, that stop using white lights. They are not photoreal. I actually have a couple of models that I can show you of exteriors where I put some lights up against the model and I made the lights amber. I actually exaggerated the point and made the lights more amber than I probably needed to. And the effect on the model was quite spectacular, because it took what was otherwise a pretty gray, boring paint job and warmed it right up. So it improved the curb appeal of the building and made it look more realistic. So pay a lot of attention to all of these subtle little details. Like, when I apply a material, let's really dial in on how that material is finished. Again, there's not a single material in this model that isn't reflecting. The only material actually behaving like a mirror, not literally a mirror, but the most mirror-like is this table. The next most mirror-like is this column. And then, of course, all of the other surfaces, because they are in the real world, they would be relatively flat. They are even less mirror-like. However, they are very reflective because light is just bouncing all over this room. Notice on the floor, this floor actually has a reflective properties set, and to some degree like mirrors. So this is a reflection of this leg, the leg of this table, or the leg of this chair into the floor. But when I dialed in the reflective property of this floor, I wanted a satin finish, not a high gloss finish on this floor. And I hope that you all will agree that it's achieved on this floor. It's a satin finish on the floor. Okay. Any more questions or comments on what we've covered? How many of you think you might be available next Thursday for a lighting webinar going from novice to expert on lighting? Okay, excellent. Lots of people saying they'll be there, so please do register as soon as you can. On most of these, we have a fairly limited opportunity to attend. But just like this webinar, I'll record it and I'll put it up on YouTube when I'm done. And then, of course, what really is equally important is the Reflections Dialogue. That'll be the following Thursday. So check our schedule on our website, renderplus.com. If you go to the tutorials page, that's a quick way to get to the webinars listing. In fact, guess what I did before we started? On the tutorials page, you will actually find a link. I have to move some things out of the way here. You'll actually find a link to the webinars. Here's the webinar schedule right off of the tutorials page. And this shows you our current IRender nXt lighting is Friday, May 22nd at 4:00 p.m. Sorry, I said Thursday. Good thing we came to the schedule. And then the reflections one is Friday, May 29th, so a week later at 3:00 Eastern Daylight Time. So that's 12 o'clock on Pacific Time. Keep an eye on this board. We intend to run at a minimum 2 webinars every week. We're just getting materials together that's going to allow us to do that. Again, our hope is that you'll have so much success with IRender nXt that when you go up against the competition, they'll wonder what in the world you're doing to create the renderings that you're creating. So if you're like me, I've got some renderings I've got to go work on. Hopefully you do too. I hope you're having good luck with IRender nXt. Even if you're just getting started and using a trial version, have fun. If you have any questions as you're experimenting with the software, please do not hesitate. Send your questions to, you can send them to either one, training or support, and we'll get answers out to you as quickly as we can to try to help you, try to keep you from struggling with any of the features that you're presented with. So I want to thank everyone. I really appreciate your being here this afternoon. I hope this was meaningful, and I hope to see you again real soon in an upcoming webinar. Thanks a lot, everybody.